Desire is a weapon, Emily, and I'm going to teach you how to pull the trigger. Emily was a dreamer who believed in the innocence of literature. That was until she met Julian, the darkest man in the city. Trapped under Marcus's ruthless editorial thumb, Emily began to learn not just how a woman is desired, but how a soul is conquered. The lessons were simple: the weight of silence, the sharpness of a gaze, and the power of a touch. But beneath the shadow of glittering galas and a life of luxury, a dark secret was festering. By the time Emily realized she was just a disposable pawn in Julian's game of revenge, the innocent girl she once was long gone. You taught me how to ruin other people's lives, Julian. Now it's your turn. Betrayal won't end at that cold, rain-washed station, because the best students always surpass their teachers. Shadow Lessons, a prescription for a broken love. To write your own story, you must first tear down the masks others have written for you. Shadow Lessons, a prescription for a broken love. Gray clouds sagging over the city had wrapped the sky like a soiled shroud. It was well past midnight, but the lights were still burning in the offices on the 20th floor of the Metropolitan magazine. This was a concrete labyrinth where success was measured only by numbers, and the soul was left forgotten in the elevator shafts. As Emily stared at the cold coffee cup on her desk, she watched the rain droplets sliding down the window, stained crimson by the glow of the neon signs. The silence in the room was broken only by the monotonous drone of the ventilation. To Emily, that sound was as terrifying as the rhythmic steps of a firing squad. The white paper in front of her stared back like an empty grave. She was only 25. When she graduated from the Faculty of Literature, her dream was to write classic novels that would live forever on dusty library shelves. She carried the innocence of Jane Austen and the tempestuous passion of the Bronte sisters in her heart. However, life had hurled her into this sterile office, right into the middle of the superficiality of modern times. A world she didn't understand, a language she didn't speak. Emily's world was built of words, but her experience lagged far behind the emotions those words expressed. All her life she had only watched. She had noted down those who lived, those who loved, and those who suffered merely as a detached observer. Suddenly, the door swung open so violently it seemed it might fly off its hinges. Marcus walked in, clutching a crumpled layout sheet. Marcus was not just the editor of the magazine, he was the greatest nightmare of Emily's life. His heavy footsteps made a thudding, arrogant sound on the carpet. He approached Emily's desk and looked down at her with that habitual narcissistic flair, as if he were inspecting an insect. When Emily caught the scent of his expensive, sharp cologne, she felt her unease heighten and her breath tighten. Marcus leaned over the desk, digging his fingers into the edge like talons. The love advice column now smelled of mediocrity. Marcus had decided to push aside Emily's pure, inexperienced, and romantic soul to rebrand the column as The Anatomy of Desire. The magazine's circulation was dragging on the floor, and the public no longer needed poetry, they needed raw honesty. Marcus's voice was like a whip echoing in the empty corridors of the office. Looking at Emily, there wasn't a shred of pity in his eyes. Your flowery prose doesn't pay the bills, Emily. People want to hear what's whispered in the darkness of bedrooms. That column will be filled by Monday. Either you write the most provocative, the most raw, the most searing sex advice in this city, or you'll be carrying your belongings out of this building in a box. As Marcus walked away, his final sentence rang in Emily's ears. She was inexperienced. Her life had never gone beyond a chaste touch. She didn't know how a woman was desired or how the dark corridors of a man's mind were triggered. When she stepped out of the office, the night wind lashed her face like a whip. The streets were deserted, only the sound of her own heels accompanied her. As she walked, she felt the void inside her growing like a black hole. The rain intensified. Seeking shelter, she found herself at the door of the Velvet Lounge. The interior was dim. The smoky air was blended with the mournful melody of an old jazz record. And that was when she saw him, a man in the darkest corner of the bar, slowly swirling a crystal tumbler in his hand. His face was shrouded in shadows, but his gaze was sharp enough to touch Emily's soul. His presence changed the entire atmosphere of the place. Emily didn't yet know that in those eyes she was seeing either her own end or perhaps her rebirth. The next morning, looking at her reflection in the mirror, Emily saw a woman she didn't recognize. The dark circles under her eyes weren't from a simple night of sleeplessness, but the marks of the uncertainty in her soul. She had to go to work, sit at that desk, and describe a skin she had never known, a touch she had never felt. Marcus's new project had spread through the magazine like wildfire. Her colleagues looked at her with either cynical pity or curious stares. Emily traced her fingers over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't flow. Each click of the keys sounded like stones being dropped into an empty room. "How do you seduce a man?" she wrote, then immediately deleted it. Her sentences were dead, soulless. That afternoon, an envelope made of heavy black paper was left on Emily's desk. It bore only her initial. Inside was an address and a time. There was no other explanation. In the depths of her heart, Emily knew this mysterious invitation belonged to the man from the corner of the bar. Fear sprouted within her, but that fear was already blended with the searing fire of curiosity. When she arrived at the address, she saw it was one of the most isolated and magnificent mansions in the city. The iron gates creaked open like the maw of a giant preparing to swallow her. The man from that night opened the door, Julian. When she first heard his name in that deep, distant voice, Emily's skin crawled. As Julian invited her in, the heavy silence inside the house took Emily's breath away. The house was no different from a museum. Everything was perfect, everything was symmetrical, but everything was chillingly soulless. Julian led Emily into a spacious study. The walls were lined with books, but the air inside didn't smell of old paper. It smelled of expensive whiskey and cold ambition. Julian made an offer. He would teach Emily how a woman is desired, how a man's mind is seized, and how a touch can be turned into a weapon. In return, Emily would play the lead role in a dangerous game Julian had planned. Julian's marriage looked like a flawless diamond from the outside, but inside it was a long, rotted prison. His wife, Elena, used Julian as an accessory for wealth and status, turning him into an emotional wreck. Julian wanted revenge on his wife. He wanted to shatter that fake perfection in front of the whole city. Emily would appear to be Julian's illicit affair, and they would drop like a bomb into the center of high society. This was a theater fueled by vengeance, and Emily was to be Julian's sharpest script. As the days passed, the lessons began, but these weren't the cheap physical lessons Emily had expected. First, Julian taught her silence. "If you want to influence someone, Emily," he said one evening, placing his glass on the table by the window, "first, your silence must have weight. People fear a vacuum, and they will give you all their secrets just to fill that void." Julian taught Emily how to look. He showed her how to look into a man's eyes as if she knew his darkest, most secret sin. He explained how a gaze could hook into someone's soul. Emily was undergoing a massive transformation by Julian's side. She was no longer the timid, bespectacled girl struggling at a typewriter. Her words had changed. Her columns no longer asked, "What is love?" Instead, they screamed, "How does desire break down the door to that dark room inside a person?" Magazine sales exploded. Marcus watched Emily's newly discovered dark genius with admiration, but the abyss inside Emily deepened every day. In every hour spent with Julian, she began to see the wounded child behind his walls of ice. Julian had been manipulated by Elena for years. Every emotion of his turned into a bargaining chip. The thirst for revenge was like a toxic blood circulating in Julian's veins. As Emily became the sharpest weapon of this revenge, she began to invest an uncontrollable reality into the fake passion Julian was teaching her. A mere touch from Julian, even his fingertips accidentally brushing her shoulder, caused tectonic shifts in Emily's world. One night, during a lesson in the library, Julian suddenly stopped. He was very close to Emily. She could feel his breath on her skin. A hesitation Julian had never shown before appeared in his eyes. He reached out and tucked a lock of Emily's hair behind her ear. This move wasn't part of the plan. Julian's fingers were trembling. "We shouldn't do this," Julian whispered, his voice drowning in itself, but his eyes couldn't hide his hunger for that forbidden fruit. At that moment, Emily realized Julian was just as lost as she was. They were both staring at each other's wounds. While Julian was drowning in the hatred he felt for his wife, Emily was losing herself in that nameless passion she felt for Julian. The heavy silence in the library that night was devastating than 1,000 confessions. When Emily looked in the mirror, she now only saw the woman Julian had created. Her own essence remained in the shadow of this grand game. The big night had arrived, the traditional winter gala held in honor of Julian's wife, Elena. All the city's elite were there with their fake necklaces and even faker smiles. As the light from the crystal chandeliers danced on the marble floor, Emily walked in on Julian's arm. She wore a midnight blue silk dress that wrapped around her body like water with every step. Julian had applied everything he taught her to the finest detail: the posture of her shoulders, the mysterious and arrogant distance in her gaze. Everything was perfect. That night, Emily was not ordinary Emily, but the most talked about, most mysterious, and most dangerous woman in the city. Elena stood in the center of the hall like the ruler of her own kingdom. As Julian and Emily approached her, even the orchestra's music seemed to pause for a moment. Whispers spread through the hall like a fire. "Who is this woman with Julian? This is a scandal." Elena's porcelain-perfect face faltered when Emily squeezed Julian's hand in a gentle but possessive gesture. The plan was working. Julian was shattering his wife's pride before the judging eyes of society. Emily thought they had won in that moment. They were filled with the strange, dark satisfaction of being part of Julian's revenge. However, in that instant, they saw Marcus was there too. Marcus raised his glass towards Emily as if saluting an accomplice. On his face was a sickening smile of victory. Emily knew at that moment that something had gone horribly wrong. Julian's gaze suddenly everted from Emily. Marcus came up to Julian and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "You did a hell of a job, Julian." Emily's latest columns doubled the circulation. "If it weren't for the special information you provided, they wouldn't have been this convincing." Emily's world collapsed within that second. Julian's revenge wasn't just against his wife. Julian had used Emily as a pawn, too. Julian and Marcus had been in cooperation from the very beginning. Those bold, passionate Anatomy of Desire columns Emily wrote were actually composed of real marriage secrets Julian had leaked to Emily to disgrace Elena. Julian had used Emily as a pen. He had made her innocence and her secret admiration for him the fuel for his revenge. Emily's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces in the middle of that magnificent hall. On the dark balcony at the back of the Gala, as the rain began to drizzle again, Emily and Julian stood face to face. The sparkle in Emily's eyes had been replaced by a dark and deep disappointment. Julian tried to speak. He took a step, but Emily's gaze pinned him where he stood. The expensive dress on Emily now felt like a heavy costume. "Was everything just a lesson to you, Julian?" Emily asked, her voice scattered in the wind, but her pain was as clear as a bullet. "Those looks you taught me, those poses, was it all for this moment? Do you think I'm just an instrument you use to finish Elena? That deal you made with Marcus, which clause of that agreement held my feelings?" Julian couldn't look at her. As the city lights flickered behind him, the shoulders of that seemingly invincible man had slumped. His voice came from a place as deep as the silence of a grave. "I had to end Elena, Emily. She took my family, my honor, my life. I didn't want to involve you in this, but your innocence, your real emotions, they were her greatest weakness. People believed what you wrote because you believed it." Emily took a step back. Her tears mingled with the raindrops. Julian's true identity was a man darkened by a thirst for revenge, a man who had sacrificed even his own soul to this ambition. Emily, on the other hand, was nothing more than a disposable pawn on this giant chessboard. "You gave me lessons in seduction, Julian," Emily said, suppressing the tremble in her voice. "But I will give you the real lesson. You're going to watch what happens when a human soul is played with so recklessly, how it turns into a wreck, and what kind of monster can emerge from those ruins." Emily did not return to the mansion that night. She didn't go to the office either. She walked through the furthest corners of the city until morning. The pain in her feet was nothing compared to the ache in her heart, but her mind had cleared. This time, she would use the power and strategy techniques Julian had taught her for her own salvation. With the first light of dawn, she entered Marcus's office. Marcus was savoring his victory, preparing the great scandal headlines for the next day. Emily slammed a file onto Marcus's desk. This file contained the illegal transactions Julian had inadvertently told her about during their lessons, as well as the secret, unlawful clauses of his prenuptial agreement with Elena. Julian had underestimated Emily. He thought she was just a girl who acted on her emotions. But Emily had recorded every word of Julian's, every confession into her mind and her notes, like evidence. "If this news is published this way," Emily said, her voice echoing in the office with icy determination, "this file goes straight to the prosecutor's office and the rival newspapers. Julian won't be left standing, you won't be left standing, and neither will this magazine. Julian's revenge will be your end too, Marcus." When Marcus saw the change in Emily's eyes, he felt real fear for the first time. The woman standing before him was no longer the inexperienced girl he could manage or threaten. He had created his own monster with his own hands. Marcus was forced to accept Emily's terms. The story was killed. Emily left her resignation letter on Marcus's desk. But before she left, she had one last move. She would leave Julian with the thing he feared most: silence and uncertainty. Toward morning, the city was hidden under a thick mist. Emily stood alone at the central train station. In her hand was only an old leather suitcase and that crumpled black envelope Julian had given her on the first day. She opened the envelope and looked at the back of the note. Julian had added a small note there, perhaps in his only honest moment. I'm sorry, Emily. You were the only true light I encountered in this dark world, but I extinguished that light for the sake of my own revenge. Emily slowly crumpled the note and dropped it onto the tracks. The metallic, rhythmic sound of the train on the rails began to be heard from a distance. Emily had learned a lot from Julian, how dangerous a mask desire actually was, how power isolates a person, and how lasting the taste of betrayal is. But most importantly, she had learned her own strength. She would no longer write stories dictated by others, scripted for the interests of others. She would be her own words, her own truth. As the train pulled into the station, Emily looked at the city's giant neon-lit towers one last time. While Julian was drowning in the silence he created in his magnificent but ice-cold mansion, Emily felt truly free for the first time. As the train moved, she left behind only an empty platform washed by the rain, a smoky past, and a woman Julian could never reach again. The dark drama ended here. Toward morning, the city was hidden under a thick mist. Emily stood alone at the central train station. In her hand was only an old leather suitcase and that crumpled black envelope Julian had given her on the first day. She opened the envelope and looked at the back of the note. Julian had added a small note there, perhaps in his only honest moment. I'm sorry, Emily. You were the only true light I encountered in this dark world, but I extinguished that light for the sake of my own revenge. Emily slowly crumpled the note and dropped it onto the tracks. The metallic, rhythmic sound of the train on the rails began to be heard from a distance. Emily had learned a lot from Julian, how dangerous a mask desire actually was, how power isolates a person, and how lasting the taste of betrayal is. But most importantly, she had learned her own strength. She would no longer write stories dictated by others, scripted for the interests of others. She would be her own words, her own truth. As the train pulled into the station, Emily looked at the city's giant neon-lit towers one last time. While Julian was drowning in the silence he created in his magnificent but ice-cold mansion, Emily felt truly free for the first time. As the train moved, she left behind only an empty platform washed by the rain, a smoky past, and a woman Julian could never reach again. The dark drama ended here, but Emily's life was starting over with that first drop of ink falling onto a white page, this time a drop that belonged entirely to her. Looking at the landscape flowing past the train window, the drama loom inside her was no longer weaving the pain of others, but her own victory. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story.